We can start. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody in Beirut and wherever you're joining us from. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome to this fireside chat my colleague, Sasha Gabuev, who's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, focusing primarily on Russia, but on Russia-China relations. Sasha, it's good to have you. Wish you were in Beirut, but next year, hopefully.
Absolutely. Happy morning from California. It's 6 a.m. here.
I hope it was fruitful, huh?
We hope so
Worth the
too. No,
sacrifice of a trip to Beirut.
uh,
Uh, Sasha, let me begin with a question with the most obvious, probably the topic that's on everybody's mind, which is Putin's war on Ukraine. And to talk about, I mean, in 2 months, it'll be almost a year since the invasion of Ukraine took place. The question is, can Vladimir Putin today keep up the momentum going and maintain the kind of military, fiscal, and human resources needed to continue with this conflict, particularly as we're witnessing the kinds of developments on the ground where there seems to be a push and pull at different levels. So your take on this, please.
we are having a split screen right now where most of global media are, for all the right reasons, celebrating Ukrainian victories like recapturing Kherson or major successes of counteroffensives this fall. Unfortunately, all of the next steps for Ukraine will be very hard. And Vladimir Putin is not constrained by too many factors to continue his onslaught on Ukraine. He's very focused. For him, capturing Ukraine, subduing to Russia, and orchestrating regime change and achieving his goal is seen as essential for survival of his regime, maybe for survival for him personally, and as something very important for Russia. So he's very committed. It's not a person who is limited by electoral cycles, opposition, independent media. All of the Russian civil society is harshly repressed. The word war is criminalized, and any criticism towards war lands you in a Russian prison for up to 10 years. The economy is not doing great, and the effect of the sanctions is felt, but it's far better than all of the projections that have been made in March. The economy will contract about 4%. Russia has enjoyed windfall of gas money throughout this year, and it has money to carry on for another 2 or 3 years. And then, in terms of human resources available, shortage of manpower has been a major problem for the Russian military with the beginning of this war. The idea that you can conquer a country of 40 million with 200,000 expeditionary force was outlandish. But nevertheless, Russia managed to draft 300,000 men in a matter of 2 months. They're poorly equipped, they're poorly trained, but it still makes a huge difference in the battlefield because it's now the Ukrainians who are in the offensive, and the losses on their side are 3-1 as an advancing side. Unfortunately, Vladimir Putin believes that he's here in the long haul, and long haul is not 1 or 2 years, but it's 5 or 7 years. He's pretty committed, and I think that resources are there.
He's pretty committed, and you think the resources there, so no end in sight is what you're saying.
I think that the most likely outcome, unfortunately, is a protracted conflict, the way we've seen between Iraq and Iran. So it can go for many months, and it can go for some years for sure.
In this case, I mean, the war on Ukraine and it was followed by significant economic sanctions against Russia, which continue to this day. And they've had an impact on Russia's economy. You just mentioned the economy, a few minutes, which already was not doing so well prior to the invasion. So the question is, how will this continued protracted conflict affect Russia's domestic affairs and its foreign policy, especially its ability mean, domestically, obviously, that's one question, but on the foreign policy level, its ability to continue with its actions in Syria, its foreign military engagements in different parts of the Middle East, let's say.
On domestic front, yes, the Russian economy was not doing great, although without the war, we would expect a growth of 3%. And with this war, we see a contraction of 4%. It's modest compared to the earlier projections of 20% GDP decrease, but nevertheless, it's a recession. But the average Russian person has witnessed decrease in real incomes since 2013. So it's not something super new. The GDP nearly doubled in the first decade when Putin was in power. So it's a pretty big cushion that you need to come down to like real poverty, and the process will be smooth. It's not that it's going to be a big cliff where Russia will fall and that will create any cracks either in the society or in the broader elite. We don't see that. The most numbered protest against this war was about 2,000 people in Moscow, a city of 17 million. And then the repressive tool is pretty much there. As for availability of resources for more muscular and assertive foreign policy, I think that we are seeing that Russia redistributes these resources and tries to make everything what it was doing on a cheaper side. It has to redistribute some forces from Africa, from the Middle East, to combat missions in Ukraine. Russia is fortunate that the situation in Syria is much more stable than at the time when Russia intervened, and the Assad regime, the Iranian allies can help and can stabilize the situation on the ground. But we are seeing major setbacks for Russia in other parts, for example, Caucasus, where Russia just doesn't have the manpower to support its Armenian ally. Nevertheless, I don't see that Russia cuts all of its investments outside of Russia's periphery. It still wants to be present in the Middle East. It still wants to be present in Africa. And since a lot of these operations have been done on the cheap side, I think that we are very likely to see Russia continuing with those.
That's interesting. So, can I just ask you then, in this question, in this context, under which conditions can we see the two sides, i.e., Moscow and Kiev, sit down together for negotiation in this broader context?
I'm very skeptical about the prospect of negotiations. The Ukrainian government, supported by the society, has 4 clear criteria for what victory means. It's restoration of 1991 internationally recognized borders, including Crimea. It's reparations. It's accountability for all the war criminals, starting from Putin and then all of the trigger pullers who killed, raped, and murdered in places like Bucha and Irpin. And then these are guarantees of Russia not invading Ukraine again. For Russia, the starter is recognition of annexation of the territories that Russia committed on September 30th. And a reminder, Russia doesn't control all of those territories for now. For example, Kherson and many cities in Donbass have gone, and Ukraine has liberated them. But that's where Putin wants to start the negotiation. So unfortunately, the red lines are absolutely incompatible, and the West is ready to support Ukraine, not necessarily to the bitter end, but for sure it doesn't want Ukraine to trade territory for peace. Neither wants the Ukrainian society. So we are stuck here.
In that case, let me just ask, I mean, during the G20 summit in November, President Xi and President Biden both warned against the nuclear weapons use, something that President Putin had threatened. Do you think this warning, particularly by President Xi, will have any impact on, or what kind of impact will it likely have on Putin?
I think that for now we are out of the immediate danger of seeing Russia using nuclear weapons. And the risk was there, and our former boss, Bill Burns, was very concerned about it and traveled to Ankara to talk to the Russian head of intelligence, Sergei Naryshkin, to talk about this single issue. And if Bill is worried about something, as we all know in Carnegie, we should be worried too. The risk was connected to the fact that should Russian troops in Kherson, 30,000 elite troops, paratroopers, Navy SEALs, special operation guys, be captured and killed by Ukrainians, it could lead to a cascading collapse of the Russian front lines all the way to the Russian border. And that would put Crimea and Donetsk, Luhansk in danger. So that would be the moment where Vladimir Putin would have to use the ultimate trump card he has, which is nukes. Fortunately, we have escaped this scenario. Russians managed to pull their troops out. The front line is stabilized. So I think that the risk of nuclear escalation is off the table. But Putin does another escalation. He's destroying Ukrainian energy infrastructure, trying to force millions of refugees to Europe. And that's something we've seen in Syria before. I don't think that statement of President Xi Jinping will have a material impact on Russian behavior. I think what could have the material impact would be Xi Jinping in private channels saying that if you threaten to use nuclear weapons or if you use them, not a drop of Russian oil will enter Chinese market. But we don't see any evidence for China framing it that way. And Chinese customs just released its statistics of trade with Russia. In the first 11 months, the trade has surpassed all of the historical records and now stands at 170 billion US and will continue to grow.
Well, then this is kind of an interesting segue because in addition to being an expert on Russia, you're also an expert on China. I know you spent many years there as well. So just to move to the Russia-China relation, the strategic relationship partnership between both China and Russia has grown stronger, especially over the past couple of years, as both parties have continuously reaffirmed their high-level cooperation on political, economic, and security issues, as well as efforts to counter Western hegemony. Earlier this year, you yourself published a piece in Foreign Affairs about how Putin's invasion has actually made Russia more dependent on China than before. Can you perhaps talk a little bit about this and talk about, how has Putin's strategy, in some sense, backfired?
We had these asymmetries in Russia-China relationship before. China is far bigger country, bigger economy. It's much more economically diverse and is the only peer competitor to the US in terms of comprehensive military, scientific, economic power, unlike Russia, which is a fake pretender and which has some elements like nuclear arsenal. It's at UNP5, but it's definitely not a peer competitor. So the asymmetry has been there, but also there is a lot of complementarity and interest. Russia and China share a border that they want to be a border of peace rather a border of confrontation. The territorial dispute has been solved. The economic structures is matching. Russia has abundance of natural resources and needs technology and money. China is the exact opposite. And then both are authoritarian states. But I think that this asymmetry was a feature, and this asymmetry was increasing as Russia's relationship with the West was worsening following annexation of Crimea, war in Donbass, interference in US elections. Now, all of the bridges are burned on the Russian side and on the Western side. The West and Russia are engaged in full-fledged economic war, and both are trying to unbuild mutual dependencies, be it Russia's exposure to the global financial system or European and Western exposure to the Russian raw materials, particularly energy resources. With that, Russia has very few outside partners, and China is the major one. And that would include Turkey, the Gulfies, and India. But China is the major destination for Russian exports and major source of Russian imports. 5 to 7 years down the road, we might arrive at a picture where 60 or 70% of Russia's trade, both export and imports, goes to China, which gives China tremendous leverage over Russia.
How do you think then this relationship, especially this tightening of the relationship between the two countries, impact Russia's relationship with India?
I think that India faces an important choice. Before the war, India saw Russia-China rapprochement as challenging and as something that India would love to prevent, also given long-standing ties between India and Russia that go back to middle of the 20th century and even before. So India tried to present itself and Japan as an alternative to partnership with China. And in addition, that would give Russia more flexibility and more options. And then obviously there is a huge dependency on Russian weapons for the Indian army. Now, after the war, I think the Indian leadership faces a problem here because they understand that China's leverage over Russia might force Russia to abandon relationship with India if China so wishes 10 years down the road. Not from now, but if 10 years down the road, Beijing says you shouldn't sell new weapons to India, otherwise your oil will not be coming to Chinese market. Russia will have no many options but to follow what Comrade Xi Jinping says. So for India, there is a need to diversify its ties and also to be more engaged with partners on Quad on weapons issue and just unbuild dependency on Russia, which might take some time. It's very opportunistic in using the current discounts that Russia is providing for its oil and gas. But again, it's not something material, and it's not something that is there for the foreseeable future. I think that India is very tactical and opportunistic here.
Let's move to another topic also. This time it's Russia and NATO. At the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, some experts argued that through this move, Putin thought he could undermine NATO, the NATO alliance. But it seems that, in fact, Putin has reinforced NATO, which, according to President Macron, to quote him, had been brain dead. So would you agree with this statement? And would you also comment on any direct communications between NATO and Russia during this war? I mean, it appears that they've remained open.
The reason why Vladimir Putin chose this time to go into Ukraine, he thought that Angela Merkel is out of the picture. President Biden is weak, particularly after Afghanistan debacle. There is no appetite to stand up to Russia. And then he also thought that Ukraine will be conquered in a matter of weeks. And by the way, this assessment was shared by senior leaders in the US government and many Western governments. He badly miscalculated. He underestimated the will and skill of Ukrainians to defend their motherland. And also, he overestimated his own army, as we know. So now NATO is galvanized. There is a clear understanding that being inside the alliance is very valuable. That's why Sweden and Finland are seeking membership and trying to enter the alliance and will be members of NATO soon. So I think that there is a bad miscalculation, Mr. Putin, as many instances of this war show. As for communications, we don't have the good communication between the alliance and Russia, but we see communications between individual members, particularly the US, which plays a paramount role in this conflict and is the linchpin of supporting Ukraine. The senior military leaders have spoken recently with the Russian threat of using nuclear weapons, but the channels of communication are not optimal. For example, recently when the Ukrainian drone has attacked the Russian airbase where Russia stores its nuclear weapons, and some of the planes are strategic bombers that carry nuclear weapons. General Milley tried to call his Russian counterpart, General Gerasimov, but he didn't return the call. So this communication definitely needs to be improved as we are entering the period where there will be more dangerous situations between Russia and NATO and more potential for dangerous miscalculations resulting from miscommunications.
Let's move, thank you, Sasha. Let's move to another topic, which actually is much closer to this region in some ways, which is the rapprochement with Iran. In the Russia-Ukraine conflict seems to have provided a major nudge for Russia and Iran to increase their bilateral cooperation as they are both facing Western sanctions. There have also been reports of Russia using Iranian drones in Ukraine. So to what extent are Russia and Iran really cooperating in the military sphere, and what other areas of cooperation are you seeing between the two countries?
We all the time had a very awkward relationship. Both countries share a lot of interests, including in Syria, including in pushing back against the US, but there's never a cordial relationship. going back to kind of centuries. And I don't think it's super cordial now. It's tactical, and both sides know which areas they can work on and which areas are not necessarily something where their interests fully coincide. So Iranian drones and maybe Iranian missiles, we don't see them in the battlefield yet, but we had some reports that the mid-range missiles will also be imported to Russia to increase the stock of Russia's tools to strike Ukrainian infrastructure. This has worked very well for Russia. Most likely it's paid in hard cash. It might include some provisions of delivery of Russian weapons to Iran, but the information is scarce at some point. So most likely we see the underwater like the part of the iceberg that's above the water, but there might be the underwater part of the iceberg as well. There is also Russian desire to participate in development of Iranian oil and gas. There has been a memorandum signed between Iranian National Company and Gazprom. But I have troubles in seeing Gazprom having the resources needed, the financial resources needed. Gazprom's European business is nearly dead and will not recover anytime soon, probably forever. Gazprom has the need to build new pipelines to China, and that's the paramount task for it to monetize its resources. And there is this idea to build gas hub in Turkey, which is not set in stone, but also will require a lot of capital. So I'm skeptical about Gazprom and Russia really being able to participate in development of Iranian natural gas resources. They need capital to do that in Russia and monetize their own resources.
Sasha, then let me ask you, I mean, given this kind of rapprochement, even if they don't cooperate on gas, and given this kind of, especially on the military front, but also on the political front, how do you see this impacting Moscow's relationship with Tel Aviv? Especially now, I mean, now Benjamin Netanyahu is back in the driver's seat in Israel. And he had a very close relationship with Putin. But now that Iranian enrichment of uranium is increasing tremendously, how will this rapprochement have an impact? And if yes, how? I mean, not to mention the constant Israeli strikes in Syria.
I think that we've seen time and again that Russia is pretty skillful in balancing its relationships with both Tehran and Bashar Assad regime, with Ankara, and with Tel Aviv. Russia is for the region, not supporting any side for real, but Russia is out there for selfish natural interests, trying to inject itself as a great power in the Middle East. Relationship with Israel has been all the time cordial but complicated. There is a great personal relationship between Netanyahu and Putin, which is important because I think that managing to talk on the most senior level for all of these difficult issues really helps. And then Putin's diplomacy is very personalized. It's very much built on the rapport he has with foreign leaders. So most likely arrival of Netanyahu is good for Russia, because with all of the delicate situation like becoming increasingly precarious with the Iran enriching uranium to 60 and other dangerous levels, there might be a more muscular response of Israel or temptation to use it. And I think that Russia and Israel will be able to talk this through and find a modus vivendi in the region, both with regard to Iran, but also Syria.
So in that context, then, on what side is Russia today in the P5+1 initiative, in the attempts of the P5+1 initiative to revive the nuclear?
Russia was interested in restoration of JCPOA before the war. I don't think that Russia is that much interest now, because competing Iranian barrels coming to the global market will decrease the price of oil and make Russia's situation and position tougher. But I don't think that Russia believes that it needs to torpedo the deal right now, given everything that's going on in Iran and between Iran and the United States.
Okay, so Russia, we're moving now to the final section of our chat today on Russia, Turkey, and the Middle East. mean, Russia and Turkey have viewed each other as long-term strategic partners and have sought to coordinate their positions on several issues, including Syria under the Astana umbrella. Russia had also suggested adopting a 3+3 format with Turkey, Iran, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia to mitigate conflicts and improve cooperation in the South Caucasus region. Turkey has also played a key role as a mediator in the Ukrainian grain deal, and the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, recently agreed with Russian President Vladimir Putin on a plan to create a gas hub in Turkey, which would redirect gas supplies from Nord Stream pipelines. So, how would you see Russia's relationship with Turkey develop as Russia's war in Ukraine continues, especially if it becomes a protracted crisis or a protracted conflict, as you're suggesting? I agree
I
with
think that Russia-Turkey is yet another very complex relationship, both going back to history. And currently, we witnessed multiple crises. You remember the Turkish-backed forces shooting down the Russian fighter jet with pilots being killed, and that leading to a rupture between Moscow and Ankara. President Erdogan and President Putin showed remarkable ability to restore ties and stay pragmatic and compartmentalizing the parts where they are competing. For example, in Libya, and then Syria is also a mixed bag. Nagorno-Karabakh, like the Armenia-Azeri conflict, is yet another example where the two sides are supporting their regional proxies. But at the same time, there is room for cooperation where the interests align. And I think that there is an interesting question, who has more leverage in this relationship? And before the war, it was unclear. Probably Russia had more leverage. But now it's, to me, it's evident that Turkey's leverage over Russia is growing. Russia really needs Turkey for imports and for parallel imports. We know that Turkey's exports to Russia is miraculously growing, and its imports from some of the European countries that cut their trade links with Russia is also growing. Something is going on there. We know that Turkey is used as a financial hub for the Russians. Many Russian people who are not under sanctions but are not welcome in Europe come to park their property, their yachts. So Turkey plays an important role. And I think that Turkey knows how to instrumentalize that and put pressure on Russia where it needs. For example, a couple of weeks back, Russia wanted to walk away from the grain deal. And it took President Erdogan just 3 days to find arguments to persuade Mr. Putin to stay in the deal and continue. It's pretty remarkable. Having said that, I don't think that Turkey will use this leverage to help and advance the cause of peace in Ukraine. It plays with Russia on multiple chessboards, starting from Libya all the way to Azerbaijan and maybe Central Asia. So it needs this leverage for various games that it's playing with Russia. And I think that the game in Nagorno-Karabakh is the most important for the time being.
Then in that case, I mean, do you see that Russia is maybe losing some of its influence in the former Soviet Union states? And what does that mean? I mean, basically, has Russia's involvement in, let's put it in a different way, has Russia's involvement in Ukraine affected Russia's influence in the Middle East and in the Caucasus? And how do you see this dynamic developing again as we move into a protracted conflict scenario where Russia is going to need more and more its external allies, just following the trend of your argument?
This war will result in significant weakening of Russia across multiple domains. It's an open-ended conflict for Russia as well. We don't know how it will end. And like I can picture you easily multiple pretty bad scenarios for Russia that would involve even Russia staying in one piece as it is. But nevertheless, for now, Russia has the resources to carry on its terrible war in Ukraine and to stay relevant in its immediate neighborhood. However, the resources are shrinking, so Russia needs to be very careful in choosing its battles. And it also creates a backlash from its immediate neighbors, particularly in Central Asia, where the residual memory of Russian imperialism is there, where there are Russian-speaking populations in countries like Kazakhstan bordering Russia. And there is growing fear about Russia's unpredictability. So these countries are looking for other options and other partners beyond Russia just to hedge against the unpredictability of the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin. The Caucasus case is very indicative. Russia used to have a lot of resources to support Armenia and to say that we won't fight for Karabakh because it's not internationally recognized. And like Yerevan was told multiple times that Russia will not get militarily involved, but then it will protect the borders of Armenia proper. Right now, Russia doesn't have that many military resources to commit to this theater. It really doesn't want to go to war with Azerbaijan, and it also needs both Azerbaijan and Turkey. So the resources it's ready to commit to support Armenia are shrinking, and that's why Armenia finds itself in a very precarious position, feeling nearly abandoned by its treaty ally, Russia, and seeking other partners like the European Union and the US to help support the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Final question to Sasha. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the relationship between Russia and various Arab countries? It's a broad question. Develop. I mean, we've seen many Arab countries, at least if not express support for Russia and its war against Ukraine, but actually refrain from criticizing for a variety of reasons, part of which is to kind of continue the diversification of their relations. How do you see this relationship developing in the coming maybe few years?
I think that with Russia destroying its relationship with the West, relationship with outside world, outside of the Western coalition becomes increasingly important. And China is definitely number one, number two, number three. But the Arab world is also of paramount importance. I think that the major avenue here is the relationship with Saudi Arabia over the oil markets. The kingdom has ability to offset the negative impact of Russian barrels going off the market, but it's this technical availability is also limited. But also, kingdom and OPEC have interest in Western coalition imposing the price cap and imposing embargo, not succeeding, because next time the West isn't happy about Saudi Arabia for a variety of reasons. There is another prominent journalist that the ruler of Saudi Arabia doesn't like. Saudi Arabia doesn't want to see this cartel of buyers as a successful tool. So it has all of the reasons to tactically support Russia in opposing the buyers' cartel in the global oil market. So we will see a lot of tactical maneuvering and the Arab countries looking for opportunities, looking for leverage, and getting some business deals with the Russians or getting Russia on their side for their own needs.
Sasha, I can't thank you enough for joining us this morning, your time, afternoon, our time, and hopefully we'll see you in Beirut next December, if not before. So please join me in thanking Sasha.